Hey everyone, welcome to the National Quilter Circle live Q&A event for December. I'm Nikki LaFoyle and I'm here with Colleen Tauke. Thank you for joining us today, Colleen.
Good morning from Iowa.
So we're very glad to have you here to answer all of our quilting questions. But before we get into that, I do want to let everyone know that we have a free download available for you. A link will be in the chat box below this video or in the description of the video for the 12 days of paper piecing quilt block pattern. So you can enter your email and get the free PDF pattern for 12 different quilt blocks sent to your email. You can download all of those at once. They're really cute, fun, holiday themed quilt blocks like a ornament and a candy cane and a really beautiful snowflake. So definitely check those out and get your holiday quilting started. And if you have any quilting related or sewing related questions for Colleen, definitely type them into that chat box so we can get them to Colleen and get them answered for you right away. And whether they're specific questions about a specific project you're working on or a more general quilting or sewing question, whether big or small, we're here to answer questions for you. So, don't feel bad if it's a super beginner question. If it's something that you don't know, is a question you have, that is what Colleen is here for today. So definitely get those questions in. So to start, Colleen, I know that we are all thinking about holiday sewing, whether it's for decor around the house or sewing for projects for gifts for people. And sometimes people think with quilting, it's going to be a big project. It's like this big queen size quilt, but that's not always true. Quilting projects can be small, they can be, quick and easy to whip up for gifts. So can you give us some suggestions for quick, fun, easy quilting projects that can be used for gifts?
Okay, there are a lot of things out there. One of the things that I have been enjoying making this summer and fall was the travel. We are going to travel again, but the little travel case that I did a class on, and it folds up. It has zippers on the inside, but they're very easy to put in. Everything's done flat. It's not a complicated kind of project. One of these can take an afternoon if you've got zippers available and some fabrics that coordinate. It closes up. You can either put a Velcro tab or you can put a magnetic snap closure on there. That's a great kind of project. It can be used to organize cords for phones and laptops and things like that, or it can be a jewelry organizer so that when we get to travel again, we can be very organized and very put together as we work. One of the other projects that I worked on years ago, I came up with an idea. I have a daughter who is always using a straightener or a curler on the bathroom counter. And we'd put in new kitchen or bathroom counters, and I really wanted to protect the surface. And I thought about it for a while and thought, there has to be a quilt project that can be pretty and protect the surface at the same time. So I created a pad, kind of like a hot pad for your cookie sheet, but this is for your curling iron and wands in the bathroom. And it has the reflective material on it. It has a few layers.
It looks like she froze up a little bit. I think she'll get that little technical issue figured out and come back in the room hopefully. But she was just showing that I think she was about to say laminated cotton on the back of that little project. There we go.
What the little add-on for this was a little sleeve that you can slide over your curling iron if you're leaving and you need to take it with you and it's still warm. You can slide it in there, and then it velcros in place inside the wrap. Everything wraps up and goes safely into your bag. So don't tell anybody, but my daughter's getting this for Christmas. So those some of the little things that we have, batting scraps, we have leftover things around. Use those, create out of that to make some really fabulous gifts. They don't have to be big. They just have to come from the heart. So
That's right. Yep. And a lot of times the smaller gifts are best because the person you're giving it to, you know, I think I appreciate smaller gifts. Like if you give me this enormous thing, like what am I going to do with this? Sometimes. I mean, that being said, my mother in law gave us an amazing quilt for our wedding that I treasure and absolutely cherish. But small gifts are great for the receiver and also great for the maker because you can just, like you said, with scraps, that's
Mhm.
really great little scrap
Nice.
house projects.
Yep.
Awesome. So we have a question here from Heather who asks, do you need to use special paper or is changing the number of stitches enough for paper piecing?
When it comes to paper piecing, you are right. Shortening the stitch length is really important so that it perforates the paper so you can take it away from your stitching without damaging it. Now, if the only thing you have on hand is, say, a printer paper, it will work. But just remember, it'll take a little bit more tug to pull that away. What I usually do is buy the cheapest level of printer paper out there. And that's a little lighter weight paper. It does tear easily. The other thing you can use and you can purchase is a tablet, like a kid's scribble tablet that you can purchase, and it has a newsprint kind of paper. And those are really great for pulling apart easily when it comes to removing the paper for paper piecing. And of course, there are specific papers out there that you can get through various quilt shops and online shops. So maybe you can, if you can't get out right now, you can use printer paper, but maybe possibly try out those others too. It may make it a little easier to take the paper away. But
Right. For
short
sure.
stitch length is the key.
Okay, great. So for someone, just trying it out, maybe just grabbing some printer paper that they have on hand, and then if they, want to do a lot more of it to make it a little bit easier, maybe a specialty paper would be good for that.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, for someone who might not know what paper piecing is, can you give us a little overview of that technique?
I don't have any visuals in front of me, but the idea is that a design is predetermined and printed onto paper. And what it kind of looks like is a coloring page. It's black and white. It has numbers, kind of like paint by number, but all of the stitching lines are straight lines. So that makes it very easy to stitch. So a lot of times paper pieced items are broken into sections. So it may not all be in one piece. You may have piece A, B, and C that have to be put together. But within that, all it is sewing by number 1, 2, 3. Now, in order to get your mind wrapped around what you're going to be doing, there are videos at National Quilter Circle that specifically will give you demonstrations on how to begin paper piecing, because we as quilters are very used to taking two pieces of fabric, putting them right sides together under the machine and a nice 1/4 inch seam. In paper piecing, it's not as vital about the 1/4 inch seam. The fabric is going to be placed under a piece of paper and you're going to be stitching on the paper following a line from beginning to end. That's the really sweet part. If you can follow a line, you can paper piece. The idea, though, is to get those fabrics aligned in the right place so that they don't slip away from where you want it to be seamed. So a video will be your companion that you can watch and stop and then watch again to get your mind kind of wrapped around what you can do with paper piecing and how to start that process. But once you get started, beware, you might become addicted. You can do very intricate designs with paper piecing, things that you look at in other quilts and say, I wonder how they did that. You can do that intricate design in paper piecing. So I've seen teeny tiny little designs.
Oh, I think she's a little bit frozen again, but yes, I think I can finish her sentence. I've seen those too, those very small pieces that look like so fidgety and so professional, but then by following those lines 1, 2, 3 in order, you can get those little pieces of fabric in your design. So
Correct. Correct.
yeah, that's a great way to get exactly what shape and what kind of picture you're looking for
Mhm.
in a quilt block. So that's a really cool technique to check out. And like you said, videos on National Quilter Circle will definitely be your friend.
Yep. Your at-home class specific for you.
Yep. All right. I have a question here from Pearl who asks, can you sharpen pinking shears? So this is something we have talked about before, and I don't think we came up with a good answer. But what are your thoughts on sharpening pinking
Pinking
shears?
shears, I would say if they're mine, I would be taking them to someone who professionally sharpens things because of all those edges and the angle has to be perfect. And pinking shears are an investment, and so you want to protect that investment. So I would take them and have them professionally sharpened. Um, they're so much fun to use in projects, especially with crafting and things. It gives you that really fun edge. I know there are pinking style or wavy style rotary blades available, but it just depends on how you're using it, I guess, the degree. But I would have them professionally sharpened.
Yeah. Yep. And I know we talked about in previous conversations, we talk about sharpening your scissors by cutting through tin foil, but it's not the same, it's just not the same because scissors, they have, you have your straight blade and this is your cutting blade, your fabric's going in there. And by cutting through tinfoil with a straight blade, you can sharpen it, but the zigzag on pinking shears is just different because it has a different angle of cutting blade. So that's the same thing I have found is the best way to sharpen your pinking shears is to have someone professionally do it, either by taking it into a shop or if you can find someone online or a shop online or something, you can send it out. Probably might be a better way to do it, depending. But sending it out and then having them sharpen it and send it back to you. So that's the best way that I have found as well. Okay. I have another question from Heather who asks, do you have any tips on working with water soluble thread? Also, can this thread be used as bobbin thread as well as top thread?
Hmm. Okay, I've used water soluble thread just a few times. I would not call myself an expert on using it. Um, I'm not sure that you would end up using it both top and bottom. It would be something that you're going to be basting because you want it to dissolve and come away later. I would have to do a little more research on that. I don't want to give a definitive answer and be wrong. So it's an interesting concept to use, and I have used it. It worked wonderfully, but I only used it on the top, and it was in something I was putting a design down for free motion quilting, and I wanted that design to come off very easily, and so the water soluble thread was used there. So.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a cool tool that I have never personally used, but I can see how it would be valuable, like you said, in basting when you want that to then be easily removed. So
Mhm.
that's something that I might check out too. I can definitely see uses for that. All right. I have a question from Lisa who asks, I would like help with binding. This is an area that I see a lot of questions on. I'm a beginner working on my first small quilt. So do you have some tips for beginner binding?
Find a YouTube video. That's really sad. But we as quilters, we're very visual. So there are videos here at National Quilter Circle that can help you out with binding. Like I said, we're very visual. So there are multiple different techniques out there and different people approach it differently. So finding a voice that you feel comfortable listening to, number one, and then some tips on getting it nice and even along. The biggest thing is, I think, when you go to create your binding, is to press it very accurately, nice and neat. When you're applying your binding, make sure that you don't stretch the binding as you apply it to your quilt. You don't want the outer edge of your quilt to curl. So make sure that you're just laying it right onto the quilt. Don't tug on it when you're putting it on. Some people do use a walking foot to ensure that they don't stretch that and it stays even.
Oh, Colleen, you gotta refresh yourself. You're frozen again. She'll be back in a minute. But yes, since there you go. I won't jump in on your question. I'll let you continue.
Technical difficulties are so much fun to overcome, but we're going to make it through. Okay, so when my mother-in-law does use her walking foot when she is applying binding. She feels that she can keep things from shifting using her walking foot. So a dual feed foot may also be a thing for you to use. I personally don't use it, but maybe it's just because of so many years of putting on binding. When you approach corners, find a video that does a really nice close-up for miters so that you can figure out that technique. Because sometimes reading it and seeing it in diagrams on paper are very hard to wrap our brains around. So find a video that gets you close-ups so that you can see the fold out back again, and then as you make a nice, neat corner. I think that's kind of the thing that usually is the hiccup for most people is the mitered corners. And they really would like to have that finish on their quilt. So whether it's the video here at National Quilter Circle, you can look for one that I did years ago when I was with Fons and Porter, but there are many out there available. So find one that will help you out, or ask a friend to send you photos step by step if you need to. I remember talking my own sister through the binding process. She was in Chicago and I was in Iowa, and it's very hard to do. That was before video and cameras could be used. So when you have to only use words, it gets kind of difficult. So video can be your best friend, but don't get discouraged. Realize that if you're a beginner, however it's done, and done is good. So the next one will get better. Don't worry about it. You'll get there. So joining the ends as you come around is another thing to look for, how to finish. There are multiple techniques for that finish. Some people will do a blunt end finish. So it's two straight edges coming together. Some will do a diagonal join. Some will do kind of a fold and tuck kind of method and go back and close that by hand. So find the one that you're comfortable with. I was taught originally the diagonal join on the machine, but then later picked up, I saw it on an Alex Anderson video at some point, how she did a fold and then came and tucked it in and finished it by hand. So there are many ways to finish. So don't feel like you have to be locked into one way to do that last little piece as you come around your project to finish it. So
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one thing that I love about sewing and quilting is there are usually a lot of different avenues to get to where you want to go. So you can kind of, pick and choose what one works best for you, what you feel most comfortable with. And I love what you said too about, getting it done, and perfect is the enemy of good. So if you try to get something perfect, you're probably going to disappoint yourself because perfect doesn't exist. So if you can get it done well, as good as you can for your ability level, then you can build on that for the next project. So getting it done is getting it done, and it's not sitting in your closet as a to be finished thing anymore. It's done. So I love that. So for binding, there are different ways to do it, single fold, double fold. But when you cut your binding fabric, even for a quilt that has straight edges, are you cutting it on the bias or are you cutting it on the straight grain?
Because I'm kind of a conservative on fabric, I tend to do straight of grain because it takes less yardage. Now, my quilts are usually created to be used. They're utility quilts. I don't think I'm creating heirloom quilts that are going to last 100 years. I would rather they be utility quilts to be used. So if they wear out, that's totally fine. I know that straight of grain binding is not as strong as bias binding, but it's good enough to go on to the next quilt. So I do most of my binding straight of grain, which means that I'm cutting my strips from selvage to selvage all the way across that direction of the fabric. Now, if you want, some fabrics are printed in a certain way that may lend itself to do a bias binding. Maybe it's straight stripes and you want it to look kind of like a candy cane swirl. Then bias binding is going to be the way you're going to go. Or if it's a plaid and you want it to be on point so that
Oh, we're frozen again. That's all right. This is the way of the world these days. We got our technology. She'll be back in a minute. She's getting pretty good at getting frozen and coming back
yeah,
in.
coming
There
back.
we go.
That plaid on point gives you kind of a diamond effect along the outer edge. So when you go to pick your binding fabric, kind of consider what will happen to it if I do it bias versus straight of grain. So that sometimes you want that special effect on the outer edges, and sometimes you just want your binding to kind of match the border or just blend in. And so maybe not doing a bias there. So um, if the outer edge of your quilt is straight and you want to be finished fast, straight of grain is kind of the ticket to go on finishing that. But don't forget about bias binding because it can be fun. You have to be a little bit more gentle. There is some stretch to bias, of course, when you're rolling that around the edge. So you're going to be more cautious of that edge. But remember, that is a tool in your toolbox that you may want to experiment with at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like what you said about keeping the fabric print in mind when deciding whether to do straight or bias, because that can be a very fun, little design detail to just shifting that pattern from, straight grain to bias, it creates such a different look to pattern, like you said. So I love that. So, like you said, if your project is straight grain or straight edges, that's when it's possible to do a straight grain binding. But if you have curved edges on your quilt, that
Mhm.
is definitely when you want to use bias because
Right.
of that that feature of the bias grain because it has stretch, right?
Exactly. I recently was assisting someone in finishing a quilt that was found. It had been sitting for 30 or 40 years, and it was a grandmother's flower garden. And it had a very shaped outer edge, which meant it had to have bias binding. 11 hours later, the hand stitching on it was finished. It does take a little bit longer when you're dealing with curves and things like that. And that was multiple shifts of edges all the way around that quilt. But yes, bias binding is a must whenever you have curves, scallops, or waves on the outer edge of your quilt. But
Mhm.
it's well worth it in the end. The effect is gorgeous. So a little sweat equity does create a perfect edge on those quilts with some bias binding.
Absolutely. And before we move on from binding to other things, I feel like we could talk about binding for a really long time. We do have another question about binding, but I also wanted to show this because I happen to have this in my sewing basket, this little visual that I've had for a very long time for Q&A purposes, but just so people can kind of get a little visual. And like you said, going on National Quilter Circle to find a video is so helpful because trying to explain with words, okay, put it up and then put it back down is kind of tricky. So this binding, and like you said, different techniques. You can sew the binding on the right side or you can sew it on the wrong side. And when you wrap it around, then do your hand stitching or you're stitching the ditch from the right side or from the wrong side. But this concept of sewing your binding onto the edge and ending stitching your seam allowance distance away from the raw edge, and then you're pulling that up to create a 45-degree angle there, and you create a straight line from your project to the binding, and then you fold it back down to create your fold in line with this edge and your raw edges aligned here. And then you can start sewing right from the edge, right from this edge, using your whatever seam allowance you've decided on, and then stitching that next edge. And then when you got that, so I've done one on this side. Then that gets wrapped around and you create that nice little miter fold in the corner. And then on the wrong side, you can just kind of fold that with your fingers to get that 45-degree miter fold on the right side. So just a starter visual for you there. Like Colleen said, there are a bunch of different ways to do it. If you wanted to do single fold or double fold, if you want to do hand stitching to finish it, or if you don't, there are a lot of different ways to do it. So you can shop around for different techniques too. And National Quilters Circle will be your friend there. Now, our other question about binding is from Christina, who asks, can you use a binding foot to attach the binding, or do you really need to attach it in 2 steps, like I just showed? Oh, she's frozen. So we'll get Colleen back and get her thoughts on that binding foot in a second. I personally have never used a binding foot.
Yep.
Colleen, have you ever used a binding foot?
I have not used it myself, but I've actually, we sell them in the shop where I work. So we all got to see it in motion. So the binding foot is an attachment that goes onto the bed of your sewing machine, and it holds the binding off to your right hand side, so into the center portion of your sewing machine. The fabric is fed into that, and then it has a mechanism that folds the fabric around, so it encases the edge of your quilt. It does single fold binding, similar to what you just demonstrated on the corners things there. So it does the magic fold as you feed it in. It curls the fabric up, encases the edge of your quilt, and stitches it in that folding stitching all in one process. There is a technique that you have to learn that goes, there are videos to support those tools on how to get make the corners and do the fold. Those do work, but they are single fold technique. As far as I know, I don't think that it doesn't work really for a double fold or a French fold binding, which most of us would use on a quilt, but they are out there. They do work nicely. It just depends on how you want to finish your quilt. If you were finishing a bunch of donation quilts and you need to do a lot of them fast, that might be the technique to pick up and learn and use that tool for that edging. But the majority of quilters still stick with the French fold, double fold binding. There are many that will do the stitch in the ditch to finish and do it by machine, or even do a decorative stitch to finish that. But there is always that classic stitch by hand on the back. So it kind of depends on what you're comfortable with. If you like hand stitching, then you probably will be finishing your quilts by hand. If you love to be finished and done quick, the machine might be your ticket. And there is no real right answer to how to finish a quilt. It's a personal choice on how you finish.
Right. And a lot of things go into making that choice. It's how much time do you have to spend? What's your skill level? Where's the quilt going? Who's it for? All of those things. So
Right.
great. I love that. All right. I have a question here from Melanie, who is asking about adding a label to a quilt. So she just finished her first quilt as a gift. Congratulations, Melanie. And she's seen some different techniques, printing on paper, sewing with borders, hand stitching on. She was thinking about embroidering a patch on my single needle machine and then fusing it and hand stitching on. So do you have any suggestions for techniques for adding labels to quilts?
There are many ways to go about it. Most of mine, I do hand printing onto the fabric with a archival safe kind of marking pen made for making labels on quilts. And then I actually stitch that to the back of my quilt. Some people like to use the machine to do a machine embroidered type label. Those are great. If you are good at your embroidery machine, more power to you. I don't have that skill, and so it's not my thing. Some people like to hand embroider a really beautiful label or saying on the back. So the way that the message or the date and name they're put on the back of the quilt, pick the one that matches the style of your quilt. And so that it kind of has a cohesive approach to it. A lot of times quilts, I think maybe you can do the fusing, I think you might be just as happy by stitching the outer edge of turning the edges and stitching that onto the quilt. If for some reason it over time that the adhesives on it may affect the fabrics. It depends. If it's a utility quilt and you don't expect it to outlive you or your ancestors, then use the fusible. But a lot of times they're hand stitched onto the back of the quilt. I've also seen a square of fabric that's folded and put in actually into the corner of the quilt. So it would be inserted. Let's see, for example, here, it's inserted here across the diagonal and then caught in the binding edges here. And the only part you have to stitch down then would be the diagonal that you put across there. So it's by using a square of fabric, folding it on the diagonal, do your little message across it, and then lay it in while you're putting your binding on and finish it that way. So there are many ways to finish, but I love to put labels on quilts, and I even taught my nieces and nephews to look for the label. The one you
Oh, we'll get her back in a second. I really like her idea of doing the corner. It seems like a good, easy place to start for your labels because it's just a square of fabric. That's easy.
Mhm.
Okay.
It's a quick way to add it in, and it's very sturdy because it's attached with two edges being actually stitched into the quilt. When my nieces and nephews were opening things, I remember my niece opening her gift, and the first thing she looked for was the message on the name on the back of the quilt. She goes, "Me name, me name." She wanted to know that was her quilt and her name was on it. So those kinds of messages on quilts can be, even though you put hours into the quilt, the message on the label actually, if you're giving it as a gift, might be the most valuable portion of the quilt. But
Right.
a lot of us think, well, I'll remember when I made it. That's okay. I don't need to mark it. Yeah, down the line, we start to forget.
Yeah.
Especially if you make a lot of quilts.
Yeah.
It Time goes by quickly and you don't realize, even if it's just your name and the year that you made it,
Mhm.
mark it, because it's fun to go back later and look at the progress of the different styles, the colors, the patterns, the progression of your quilting, even how things change through style, through what was in fashion, what was going on at the time in your life. And so it's kind of a diary of who we are as quilters, also. And one quilt that my grandmother made years ago, I made a label to put on it later because she didn't mark it. And we all had to go back and try to figure out how old the fabrics were in it. What the last piece entered in there was sometime in the late 70s. So we could mark it because she was like, oh, that old thing, you don't need to mark that. Well,
Yeah.
yeah, it's our history. It's part of who we are, the fabric of who we are, literally. So those labels can be more important than you think.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that, you know, our history of sewing and quilting and our our skill level, the way of, adding dates to see that progress. It's like a diary or like a photo album kind of.
Mhm.
And quilts too, knowing like the date that you made it, you can go back and say, oh, look at, I remember making this quilt. I remember what else was going on in that year. So it can trigger memories and be a little diary entry kind of. I love that.
Yep.
So yeah, adding labels is such a great idea, and it can be super easy, not only for yourself but for gifts, and making that gift just extra personal. So before we move on, if anyone's just joined us, I do want to mention again, we have a free download available for you, the 12 days of paper piecing. The link will be in the description or in the chat box below this video. And that's just 12 quilt block patterns, PDF patterns that are free, available for you to download, different holiday themes. So definitely check those out, get some inspiration for some holiday quilting and for your next project. So check that out. Now let's move on with some more questions. Lisa asks, Can a Cricut maker be used for quilting?
As long as the blade is sharp enough to get through fabric. That's the ticket. My daughter recently was working on something, and we thought, oh, we could cut this out quick out of a little applique off of the out of fabric. And when she put it in, it started to cut, and then it started to drag, and so the blade needed to be replaced. Now, there are different levels of cutters and machines out there that do those kinds of cutting. Make sure that the machine, that the one you're working with has that capability first. You may also want to make sure that it has a nice sharp blade before you put it in there, and that you have extra fabric in case something does fail. Because when we want to be done in a hurry and we only have a little piece of fabric, if it's very if that's the last piece, you want to make sure that it's going to work. So maybe test it on a sample piece or a scrap first, but they can be used, yes.
Yep, that's a good idea. Test, preserve that last little scrap of fabric like it's gold. Be sure before you cut into that, definitely. So a Cricut maker, that's that machine. I've seen one work. I haven't really used one, but that's the machine that cuts out, any kind of shape you want. You can load your own shape into it. If it's like a really detailed, curvy, whatever kind of shape, it will cut that out for you out of paper, out of fabric, for any type of craft thing. Is it made for fabric or is it made for paper? Oh, she's frozen again. She will be back in a moment. But yeah, those Cricut makers are really nifty and handy, especially if you, oh, I think my neighbor used one for cutting out decals. He was cutting out decals to put on shirts.
Right.
So it's not made for fabric, but it can be used for fabric.
Originally made for paper, vinyl, those kinds of things. And then once that industry found out that quilters might be interested, they created ones that have the ability to cut through fabric, and foil and a few other kinds of things, so that it can take on multiple uses. I think whenever quilters, that people find out what quilters do, they also want to get into that fun too, because we create so diverse of items that they all want a piece of our quilt world.
Absolutely. So if you were using a Cricut to cut out like an applique for a quilt, would you fuse the fusible web to the back of the fabric and then cut it out?
Yes.
Okay.
And that was the thing. We needed to use a fusible that wasn't tacky. It needed to not have any drag on the blade. And so at the time we didn't have any available, and it was late at night. Those projects where like, I have this fabulous idea and I want to do it now. And so make sure that you're using a fusible that isn't tacky, that you can iron to the back of your fabric first. Use a very lightweight shear as possible, and then it has the ability with a nice sharp blade to get through those layers without messing up your design. But yeah, anything you can imagine and put on your screen, basically it can capture and cut out of things. So it's a possibility. There are so many ways to create the designs that we dream up that it's almost endless.
Yep. I love that about what we do. It's fantastic. All right. I have a question from Ed who asks, can you recommend a great pattern using paper piecing? I did a twisted log cabin and really enjoyed the technique.
Hmm. There are multiple patterns out there. It's pretty endless. There are published books, things that you could purchase online. The log cabin is a fun one to do that way, because it keeps us very honest, because in log cabins, if we're just cutting pieces and adding, we tend to get a stretch and a skew going on. So with paper foundation, it helps us stay very square. Everything stays nice and neat. I would probably end up going through the internet and looking for ideas just by searching under that idea. There are so many. I don't know if I can narrow down just one. I have an entire book of just Christmas angels in one
Yeah.
book at home. So, and then I have others that's just so varied. Um, I did a class using a foundation kind of thing. You can also do the pineapple quilt foundation, depending on how big you're going to go. I was using a tool for mine, but the classic design is done foundation paper, which makes a fabulous design. So that might be one. If you liked a log cabin and the effect of colors going around and changing, I would look at the pineapple and see if that's a block that interests you because it has some similarities to a log cabin, so it might intrigue you.
Nice. Okay. Some good things to look at. Love it. I have a question here. Have you used edge to edge quilting software? And if you have, is it user friendly?
I personally do not have the software for my long arm. I do edge to edge, just hand driven myself, but my mother in law does have that kind of machine. And it is become more and more user friendly. She bought her machine years ago when they first came out with a lot of the computerized digital designs for edge to edge. And though she's a retired person, she's computer savvy to some degree, she learned it quite quickly. So I would say that it's pretty user friendly. Usually those also come with classes and courses you can take online or through the dealer you purchase them through. So those are very easy to pick up, I believe, because the way it's sized. And I have also seen through my last job, we always did episodes through PBS, and someone was demoing. Um,
Oh, she's frozen again. She'll have to jump out and jump back in for us. And she can continue talking about our edge to edge quilting um, and her experience with that. There you are.
Yes, I remember watching and just becoming mesmerized how with just a few clicks, finding a design you like, a few clicks here and there, and it would multiply it and stretch it out, and it would fit across the quilt. And it was amazing that the computer can just take that design that you love, make it just the right size, and go edge to edge across your quilt beautifully. So the technology is amazing. And if that is something you really desire to do, jump into it. My recommendation is always if you have a passion for it, go for it.
Absolutely. Absolutely try. And technology is, advancing so quickly and it's absolutely your friend, all these tools that we have started using, technology is also a tool. So it can help expand your horizons for your projects so much. So that is great. And I want to get this question in here about batting because I know batting is a great topic for conversation. So the question is, what is the best batting for hand quilting?
Any batting without a scrim. When we talk about battings, on some battings there is a scrim, a layer put to the back to kind of keep its shape, and that helps in the long arm machine quilting process. So whenever you're looking for something that you want to use for hand quilting, make sure that it is a batting that does not have a scrim applied to it so that you can easily slide and rock the needle through the batting and through the layers so that you can have success. Now, as for cotton versus polyester versus wool, that is a personal choice. Probably the one that I would say, and I have a friend who is very, very good at hand quilting. In fact, she's an award-winning hand quilter at the state fair level within our state, and I used to work with her. She would say that wool batting is supreme above all for hand quilting because the needle glides through with that little bit of lanolin that's in wool. It just slides beautifully through. It makes it a very lightweight quilt and it makes it a very warm quilt. So wool would probably be the one that I would say is the easiest to quilt through. It is going to be a little bit more expensive because wool is just a higher grade of batting. Polyester batting is also used, and usually a denser, not a super high loft batting, but a low loft polyester batting is also easily hand quilted through. The needle rocks very nicely through that. 100% cotton can also be used, but just make sure it's without a scrim to it. It kind of depends on if you want it to have that crunched kind of quilty, crinkly look. The cotton does that. It has that shrink factor to it, where the polyester batting will not. So that your fabric may shrink up a little bit, the batting won't as much. So you get a little flatter, more sleek appearance to those quilts. But if you're willing to be a little adventurous, try all three of those and see what you like the best. But you may find that wool is going to be your favorite if you like to hand quilt.
Yep. Yep. And the fiber contents definitely have different properties. So getting a feel for it yourself is,
Mm-hmm.
always the ideal way. But those are some great tips about batting. I love that.
And the wool that is out there today is a washable wool, so don't worry about that. You may want to check to see if there's any worry consideration about allergens, but just investigate. Try those. It's just like the different techniques in quilting. Do I like foundation paper piecing? Do I want to use a go cutter so that I don't have to do a lot of cutting, or do I just like to do my own thing?
Yep.
It's the adventure.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. The adventure is half the fun. That's great. Okay. I have a question from Maria. She says she has a question about cutting squares. I start off with the right size blocks, but I'm not sure how some of my squares can be off. Is there a proper way to hold and cut with a rotary cutter? So tips for making sure squares are the right size and they're even when using a rotary cutter.
Okay, when we're working with our rotary cutter, and I'm trying to get one out of my drawer here quick so that we can talk about technique a little bit. And I pull out the largest one I have. So here we go. Good visual. The biggest thing with a rotary cutter and
We'll have to have Colleen refresh so we can talk about rotary cutters. I think she's got a bunch of different sizes of rotary cutters, some which are good for some projects and some which are good for others. I only use a 45 millimeter rotary cutter blade.
yep, with a rotary cutter, the biggest thing that people usually have is how they're holding the rotary cutter. Now, if you hold it, and I've got my arm up high, but you want it to be perpendicular to your cutting surface. So make sure that you're not angling your blade or angling it this way, because if your ruler is here, we're going to pretend this is a ruler because it's very large. But if you were to angle it out in a way, you see that it's not against the ruler. You want it straight up against it this way. So make sure that your posture when holding the rotary cutter is good, that you're perpendicular to the cutting surface. That's important. Number two, make sure that you are using your ruler proper, because some rulers have a half inch on one side, and then on the other side it goes 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch, 4 inch. Make sure you're using the right side of your ruler. If your cutting rulers are getting older, and I know they're an investment, but if you've been a quilter for 15 years, your ruler edge may be wearing away and you may be losing some of the accuracy on your rulers. So that's important. Making sure that your ruler doesn't shift while you're cutting. That's the other thing. They tend to want to shift while we're working and cutting. And as we go to the far end, we might be getting a drift or a slide. So pay attention to how you're holding it. If you have to drop your pinky even off the edge of the ruler a bit to help stabilize that edge so it doesn't drift, that's important. There are products you can put on the back of your ruler if you tend to have a little drift that will give it a tackiness. There are ones. that you can purchase now that have a tacky kind of finish on the backside of the entire ruler, and they don't shift at all. When I first started working in the quilt shop here in Iowa, we had those, and I thought, oh, this is just a ruler. But when I picked it up to move it, it doesn't shift. Literally, it doesn't shift away. So you have to pick it up to move it if you want to adjust a little bit. So that can help your accuracy increase. Um, if you're very new to quilting, find a fabric that you may have purchased and thought, why did I purchase it? And use it to practice on. When I'm teaching beginners, I tend to have them cut what I call spaghetti, is take a piece of fabric and cut it into tiny strips. But it's just getting muscle memory so that we have good posture, good hand grip on the rotary cutter, always pushing away from the body in a nice continuous motion. Those kinds of things, those kind of practicing things that we need to do if you're a beginner or if you're coming back to quilting and maybe, it's been a while since you used it. Get that motion down as you jump into your cutting, because that accuracy can make a difference in your piecing.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you're working with those pieces that are building on each other to then build onto something else, you're piecing your rows and getting your rows pieced together. It does add up if you're a little bit off here and there. So those are some great tips for accurate cutting, which is something that I think everybody can use, myself for sure. So thank you for being here, Colleen, to answer these quilting questions for us. It's always great to see you. And I want to thank all of our viewers for joining us. Remember to download those 12 quilt block patterns. The link will be in the video description or in the chat box. So that's a fun way to jump off into some other quilting projects. So thank you, everyone. Again, thank you, Colleen, and happy holidays.
Happy holidays.